Chapter 16. The Aesthetic Emotions. By the aesthetic emotions is meant those emotional feelings which are concerned with the perception of beauty or taste, and by reason of which we like or dislike certain perceptions of sensory impressions. In order to get a better idea, let us consider what is meant by beauty and taste. Beauty is defined as that quality or assemblage of qualities in an object which gives the eye or the ear intense pleasure, or that characteristic in an object which gratifies the intellectual or moral feeling. Taste, in this sense of the term, is defined as nice perception, or the power of perceiving and relishing excellence in human performances, the power of appreciating the finer qualities of art, the faculty of discerning beauty, order, congruity, proportion, symmetry, or whatever constitutes excellence, particularly in the fine arts or literature, the faculty of the mind by which we both perceive and enjoy whatever is beautiful or sublime in the works of nature and art. The possession of taste ensures grace and beauty in the works of an artist, and the avoidance of all that is low or mean. It is as often the result of an innate sense of beauty or propriety as of art education, and no genius can compensate for the want of it. Tastes differ so much among individuals, nations, or in different ages and conditions of civilization, that it is utterly impossible to set up a standard of taste applicable to all men and to all stages in the evolution of society. The aesthetic sense, feeling, and emotion are products of the later stages of the evolution of the mind of man. Their roots, however, may be seen in the crude attempts at decoration and adornment in the savage, and still further back in the tendency of certain birds to adorn their nests or bowers. Moreover, some sense of beauty must exist in the lower animals, which are influenced thereby in the selection of their mates, the bright plumage of the birds, and the colouring of the insects and higher animals evidencing the existence of at least a primitive aesthetic sense. Herbert Spencer says that one characteristic of the aesthetic feelings is that they are separated from the functions vitally requisite and necessary to sustain life, and it is not until the latter are reasonably well satisfied that the former begin to manifest in force. The authorities hold that the basic element concerned in the manifestation of the aesthetic emotional feeling is the sensory element, which consists of the pleasure arising from the perception of objects of vision or hearing which are deemed beautiful. There is a certain nervous satisfaction which arises from the perception of the sensation of the sight of a beautiful thing, or the hearing of beautiful sound. Just why certain sights prove agreeable and others disagreeable, or certain sounds pleasant and others unpleasant, is very difficult to determine. Association and habit may have something to do with the beauty of sight object, and there may be natural harmony of vibration in colours as there is in sound. In the case of sounds, there is undoubtedly a natural harmony between the vibrations of certain notes of the scale, and inharmony between others. Some have held that the secret of the enjoyment of music is found in the natural appreciation of rhythm, as rhythm is a cosmic manifestation evident in everything from great to small. But these theories do not account for the differences existing in the tastes regarding colour and music manifested by different individuals, races, and classes of people. Grant Allen says, "The vulgar are pleased with great masses of colour, especially red, orange, and purple, which give their coarse nervous organisation the requisite stimulus. The refined, with nerves of less calibre but greater discriminativeness, require delicate combinations of complementaries and prefer neutral tints to the glare of the primary hues. Children and savages love to dress in all the colours of the rainbow. In the same way persons of certain types of taste are pleased with ragtime and cheap rollicking songs or dances, while others shudder at these and find delight in the classic productions of the great composers." There is also the intellectual element to be reckoned with in the aesthetic emotions. The intellect must discover the beauty in certain objects before the emotion is aroused by the perception. Halleck says, Every time the mind discerns unity amid variety, order, rhythm, proportion, or symmetry, an aesthetic emotion arises. The traveller with a trained intellect will see far more beauty than an ignorant one. In looking at a cathedral, a large part of the aesthetic enjoyment comes from tracing out the symmetry, from comparing part with part. Not until this process is complete will the full beauty of the structure as a whole be perceived. If the traveller knows something of the medieval architecture before starting on his European trip, he will see far more beauty. The opposite of the aesthetic, which we call the ugly, is the unsymmetrical, the disorderly, that in which we can discover no rhythm, plan, or beauty. The element of associative suggestion also enters into the manifestation of aesthetic emotional feeling. The mind accepts the suggestion of the beauty of certain styles of art, or the excellence of certain classes of music. There are fashions in art and music as in clothes, and what is thought beautiful today may be deemed hideous tomorrow. This is not entirely due to the evolution of taste, for in many cases the old fashions are revived and again deemed beautiful. There is, moreover, the effect of the association of the object of emotion with certain events or persons. This association renders a thing popular, and therefore agreeable and beautiful for the time being. The suggestion in a story will often cause the beauty of a certain scene or the harmony of a certain piece of music to dawn upon thousands of persons. Some noted person sets the seal of approval upon a certain picture or musical composition, and lo, the multitude calls it beautiful. It must not be supposed, however, that the crowd always counterfeits this sense of beauty and excellence which has been suggested to it. On the contrary, genuine aesthetic feeling often results from the discovery so made. There is style and fashion in the use of words, resulting from fashion, which gives rise to aesthetic feelings regarding them. These feelings do not arise from a consideration of the nature of the object expressed by the word. Of two words designating the same thing, one causes disgust, and the other at least passive tolerance. For instance, in speaking of the sensible moisture which is emitted from the pores of the skin, we may use either of the respective terms sweat or perspiration. Both mean the same thing, and have an equally respectable origin, but to many persons the word sweat causes an unpleasant aesthetic emotion, while the word perspiration is accepted without remonstrance. Some persons abhor the term victuals, while viands or food are accepted without protest. There is often an unpleasant, low, vulgar association connected with some words, which accounts for the disfavour with which they are received, and which association is absent from the more polite terms employed to indicate the same thing. But in other cases there is nothing but the simple suggestion of fashion and style to account for the aesthetic acceptance or rejection. It is possible that some psychologist of the future will establish the truth of the theory now tentatively advanced by a few investigators, namely, that taste and the sense of beauty depend almost entirely upon the element of suggestion, manifested as association, influence of authority, habit, fashion, imitation, etc. It is known that the emotional nature is peculiarly liable to suggestion, and that taste may be created or destroyed by repeated suggestion under the most favourable circumstances. It is thought likely that if we could trace back to its roots every emotion of taste, we would find it arising from some associative, suggestive influence connected with another and more elemental class of emotions. Regarding the fact that there is no universal standard of taste or beauty, Halleck says, "It has been said that aesthetics cannot be created in a scientific way, because there is no standard of taste. De gustibus non est disputandum. There is no disputing about tastes," is an old proverb. Of two equally intelligent persons, one may like a certain book, the other dislike it. While it is true that the standard of taste is a varying one within certain limits, it is no more so than that of morals. As men's nervous systems, education, and associations differ, we may scientifically conclude that their tastes must differ. The greater the uniformity in the factors, the less does the product vary. On the other hand, within certain limits, the standard of aesthetics is relatively uniform. It is fixed by the majority of intelligent people of any age and country. To estimate the standard by which to judge of the correctness of a language, or of the literary taste of any era, we examine the conversations of the best speakers, the works of the standard writers. The aesthetic emotions may be developed and cultivated by exercise and practice, and particularly by association and familiarity with beautiful things, and with those who have good taste. Appreciation of beauty is more or less contagious, up to a certain point of development at least, and if one wishes to recognize, understand, and appreciate beauty, he should go where beauty is, and where its votaries are gathered. The study of standard works of art, or objects of nature, or the best productions of the composers of music, will do much to develop and unfold one's higher aesthetic feelings and understanding. It is claimed by some of the best authorities that to develop the finer and higher aesthetic feelings and understanding we must learn to find beauty and excellence in things removed from ourselves or our selfish interests. The narrow selfish emotions kill the aesthetic feelings. The two cannot exist together. The person whose thoughts are centered on himself or herself very rarely finds beauty or excellence in works of art or music. Grant Allen well sums up the subject in the following words: "Good taste is the progressive product of progressing fineness and discrimination in the nerves, educated attention, high and noble emotional constitution, and increasing intellectual faculties." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. The Intellectual Emotions. By the intellectual emotions is meant that class of emotional feeling resulting from the presence of objects of intellectual interest. This class of emotions depends for its satisfaction upon the exercise of the intellectual faculties, from the most simple to the most complex, and including perception, memory, imagination, reason, judgment, and all the logical faculties. Those who are accustomed to employing the mind through voluntary attention, particularly in the direction of creative ideation or constructive imagination, experience these emotions to a greater or less degree. The exercise of perception, if we are skilled therein, gives us a pleasurable feeling, and if we succeed in making an interesting or important discovery by reason thereof, we experience a strong degree of emotional satisfaction. Likewise, we experience agreeable feelings when we are able to remember distinctly something which might well have been forgotten, or when we succeed in recalling something which had escaped our memory for the moment. In the same way the exercise of the imagination is a source of great pleasure in many cases, in the direction of writing, planning, inventing, or other creative processes, or even in the building of air castles. The exercise of the logical faculties gives great pleasure to those in whom these faculties are well developed. Halleck well says, "There is probably not a happier moment in Newton's life than when he has succeeded in demonstrating that the same power which caused the apple to fall held the moon and the planets in their orbits. When Watt discovered that steam might be harnessed like the horse, when an inventor succeeds in perfecting a labour-lightening device, whenever an obscurity is cleared away, the reason for a thing understood, and a baffling instance brought under a general law, intellectual emotion results." The pleasurable feelings we experience upon the reading of a good book, or the discovery of real poetry, are forms of intellectual emotion. The same class of emotional feeling is aroused when we witness a good play. Among other instances of this class we mention the perception of clever work of any kind, intricate machinery, ingenious devices, helpful improvements, or other works of man which indicate the existence of thought and inventive ability in the designer or builder. To appreciate mental work of this kind we must bring a mind developed along the same or similar lines. It has well been said that before one can take away anything from a book he must bring something to it. It takes mentality to recognize and appreciate mentality, or the work of mentality. The study of scientific subjects is a source of great pleasure to those who are inclined to such pursuits. To the scientific mind the study of the latest work on a favourite branch gives a joy which nothing else is capable of arousing. To the philosopher the works of other philosophers of the same school give intense satisfaction. It is claimed that the sense of humour and wit is an intellectual emotion, for it depends upon the detection of the ludicrous features of a happening. Certain psychologists have held that the distinctive element of humour is a feeling attendant upon the perception of incongruity, while that of wit is the feeling of superiority on the part of the witty person, and a corresponding chagrin of the object of his wit. It would seem, however, that the appreciation of wit must depend upon the intellectual perception of cleverness of expression, and the pleasure resulting from the discovery thereof, and that the feeling of humour is aroused principally by reason of the incongruous element. The feeling of self-satisfaction, as contrasted with the discomfiture of the other person, belongs to the more selfish emotions. An authority says, "Humour is the mental faculty which tends to discover incongruous resemblances between things which essentially differ, or essential differences between things put forth as the same, the result being internal mirth or an outburst of laughter. Wit does so likewise, but the two are different. Humour has deep human sympathy, and loves men while raising a laugh against their weaknesses. Wit is deficient in sympathy, and there is often a sting in its ridicule. Somewhat contemptuous of mankind, it has not the patience to study them thoroughly, but must content itself with noting superficial resemblances or differences. Humour is patient and keenly observant, and penetrates beneath the surface, while therefore the sallies of wit are often one-sided and unfair. Those of humour are, as a rule, just and wise. The development and cultivation of the intellectual emotions depend, of course, upon education, training, exercise, and practice. The cultivation of the intellect, which has been referred to, in part, in the previous parts of this book, and which will again be considered in the chapters devoted to the intellect, results in the development and cultivation of the emotions accompanying intellectual effort. In a general way, however, it may be said that the reading of the best works of fiction, science, and philosophy will bring out in time the best form of intellectual enjoyment and feeling. The highest gives the best. That is the rule. The present chapter should be read and studied in connection with those devoted to the intellect. Blended emotions. As we have said at the beginning of our consideration of the subject of the emotions, the majority of emotions are composed of several feelings, and tend to blend and combine emotional elements. For instance, the emotion of sexual love certainly has its origin in the instinctive feelings of the race, and its motive element is that of passion. But passion is far from being all there is in human sexual love. Above the plane of passion is found the social emotion of companionship, protection, and care, the desire for the welfare of the loved one, the mingling of the love of the parent with that of the mate. Human love manifests many of the altruistic emotions during its course. The welfare of the loved one becomes the chief concern of life, often stronger even than self-preservation. The joy of the loved one becomes the greatest joy, far surpassing the more selfish forms of happiness. Then come the aesthetic feelings, which find satisfaction in the two liking the same things, sympathy and community of feeling being the connecting link. The several ideals of the two combining, there is produced an idealistic union which is often called spiritual harmony. Finally, there is found the blending of the intellectual emotions, in which harmony there exists one of the highest forms of pleasure satisfaction between two persons of opposite sexes. It is said that the more things that a man and woman like in common, the closer will be their liking for each other. "I love you because you love the things I love," is no rare thought and expression. So it is seen that though born in elemental instinct and passion, human sexual love is something far different in its flowering. And yet, Without its root it would not be and cannot be. This is an excellent example of the complex nature of the most common emotions. It may be used as a typical illustration. What is true of it is also true in a way and in a degree of every other form of emotion. Therefore, in studying a particular emotion, be not too quick to cry, "It is this, it is that," but rather seek to say, "It is composed of this and that." Few, if any, emotions are simple. The majority are very complex, hence the difficulty of satisfactory classification and the danger of dogmatic definition. End of chapter 17. End of section 7. Chapter 18. The Role of the Emotions. The average person greatly underestimates the part played by the emotional nature in the mental activities of the individual. He is inclined to the opinion that, with the exception of the occasional manifestation of some strong emotional feeling, the majority of persons go through life using only the reasoning and reflective faculties in deciding the problems of life and guiding the mental course of action. There can be no greater mistake concerning the mental activities. So far from being subordinate to the intellect, the emotional nature in the majority of cases dominates the reasoning faculties. There are but very few persons who are able to detach themselves, even in a small degree, from the feelings and to decide questions cold-bloodedly by pure reason or intellectual effort. Moreover, there are but few persons whose wills are guided by pure reason. The feelings supply the motive for the majority of acts of will. The intellect, even when used, is generally employed to better carry out the dictates of feeling and desire. Much of our reasoning is performed in order to justify our feelings, or to find proofs for the position dictated by our desires, feelings, sympathies, prejudices, or sentiments. It has been said that men seek not reasons, but excuses for their actions. Moreover, in the elementary processes of the intellect, the emotions play an important part. We have seen that attention largely follows interest, and interest follows from feeling. Therefore our attention, and that which arises from it, is dependent largely upon the feelings. Thus feeling asserts its power in guarding the very outer gate of knowledge, and determines largely what shall or shall not enter therein. It is one of the constantly appearing paradoxes of psychology that while feelings have originally arisen from attention, it is equally true that attention depends largely upon the interest resulting from the feelings. This is readily admitted in the case of involuntary attention, which always goes out toward objects of interest and feeling, but is likewise true of even voluntary attention, which we direct to something of greater or more nearly ultimate interest than the things of lesser or more immediate interest. Sully says, "By an act of will I may resolve to turn my attention to something, say a passage in a book. But if, after the preliminary processes of adjustment of the mental eye, the object opens up no interesting phase, all the willing in the world will not produce a calm, settled state of concentration. The will introduces mind and object. It cannot force an attachment between them. No compulsion of attention ever succeeded in making a young child cordially embrace and appropriate, by an act of concentration, an unsuitable and therefore uninteresting object. We thus see that even voluntary interest is not removed from the sway of interest. What the will does is to determine the kind of interest that shall prevail at the moment." Again, we may see that memory is largely dependent upon interest in recording and recalling its impressions. We remember and recall most easily that which most greatly interests us. In proportion to the lack of interest in a thing do we find difficulty in remembering or recalling it. This is equally true of the imagination, for it refuses to dwell upon that which is not interesting. Even in the reasoning processes we find the will balking at uninteresting subjects, but galloping along, pushing before it the rolling chair of interesting intellectual application. Our judgments are affected by our feelings. It is much easier to approve of the actions of some person we like, or whose views accord with our own, than of an individual whose personality and views are distasteful to us. It is very difficult to prevent prejudice, for or against, from influencing our judgments. It is also true that we find that for which we look in things and persons, and that which we expect and look for is often dependent upon our feelings. If we dislike a person or thing, we are usually able to perceive no end of undesirable things in him or it, while if we are favourably inclined, we easily find many admirable qualities in the same person or thing. A little change in our feeling often results in the formation of an entirely new set of judgments regarding a person or thing. Halleck well says, "On the one hand, the emotions are favourable to intellectual action, since they supply the interest one feels in study. One may feel intensely concerning a certain subject and be all the better student. Hence the emotions are not, as was formerly thought, entirely hostile to intellectual action. Emotion often quickens the perception, burns things indelibly into the memory, and doubles the rapidity of thought. On the other hand, strong feelings often vitiate every operation of the intellect. They cause us to see only what we wish to remember only what interests our narrow feeling at the time, and to reason from selfish data only. Emotion puts the magnifying end of the telescope to our intellectual eyes where our own interests are concerned, the minimizing end when we are looking at the interest of others. Thought is deflected when it passes through an emotional medium, just as a sunbeam is when it strikes water." As for the will, the best authorities hold that it is almost, if not entirely, dependent upon desire for its motive force. As desire is an outgrowth and development of feeling and emotion, it is seen that even the will depends upon feeling for its inciting motives and its direction. We shall consider this point at greater detail in the chapters devoted to the activities of the will. We would remind you again, at this point, of the great triangle of the mind: the emotional, ideative, and volitional activities, feeling, thinking, and willing, and their constant reaction upon each other and absolute interdependence. We find that our feelings arise from previous willing and ideation, and are aroused by ideas and repressed by will. Again we see that our ideas are largely dependent upon the interest supplied by our feelings, and that our judgments are influenced by the emotive side of our mental life, the will also having its part to play in the matter. We also see that the will is called into activity by the feelings, and often guided or restrained by our thoughts, the will indeed being considered as moved entirely by our feelings and ideas. Thus is the trinity of mental forces seen ever in mutual relation, constant action and reaction ever existing between them. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. The Emotions and Happiness. Happiness has been defined by an authority as the pleasurable emotion arising from the gratification of all desires, the enjoyment of pleasure without pain. Another has said that happiness is the state in which all desires are satisfied. But these definitions have been attacked. It is held by many that a state of absolute satisfaction of desire would not be happiness, for happiness consists largely in pleasurable anticipation and imaginings which disappear upon the realization of the desire. It is held that absolute satisfaction would be a negative state. Paley expressed a better idea when he said that any condition may be denominated happy in which the amount or aggregate of pleasure exceeds that of pain, and the degree of happiness depends upon the quantity of this excess. Some have held that an existing contrast between pain and pleasure, the balance being in favour of the latter, is necessary to establish happiness. Be this as it may, it is admitted by all that one's happiness or unhappiness depends entirely upon one's emotional nature and the degree of the satisfaction thereof. And it is generally admitted that to be happy is the great aim and object of the life of the majority of persons, if indeed not of every person, the happiness of course depending on the quality and degree of the emotions forming the person's emotional nature. Thus it is seen that we are dependent upon the emotional side of our mental life in this, as in nearly everything else making life worth while. Theologians have often sought to point out that happiness is not the goal of life and living, but human nature has always insisted that happiness is the greatest end, and philosophy has generally supported it. But wisdom shows that happiness is not always dependent upon the pleasure of the moment, for the sacrifice of immediate pleasure frequently results in a much greater happiness in the future. In the same way, an immediate disagreeable task often gains for us a greater satisfaction in the future. Likewise, it is frequently greater happiness to sacrifice a personal pleasure for the happiness of others than it would be to enjoy the pleasure of the moment at the expense of the pain of the other. There is often a far greater pleasure resulting from an altruistic action of self-sacrifice than in the performance of the selfish egoistic act. But as the subtle reasoner may insist, the result is the same, the ultimate happiness and satisfaction of the self. This conclusion does not rob the altruistic act of its virtue, however, for the person who finds his greatest pleasure in giving pleasure to others is to be congratulated, as is the community which shelters him. There is no virtue in pain, suffering, sacrifice, or unhappiness for its own sake. This illusion of asceticism is vanishing from the human mind. Sacrifice on the part of the individual is valuable and valid only when it results in higher present or future happiness for the individual or someone else. There is no virtue in pain, physical or mental, except as a step to a greater good for ourselves or others. Pain, at the best, is merely nature's alarm and warning of "not this way." It is also held that pain serves to bring out pleasure by contrast, and is therefore valuable in this way. Be this as it may, no normal individual deliberately seeks ultimate pain in preference to ultimate happiness. The greatest ultimate happiness to oneself and to those he loves is the normal and natural goal of the normal person. But the concept of "those he loves" in many cases includes the race as well as the immediate family. Wisdom shows the individual that the greatest happiness comes to him who controls and restrains many of his feelings. Dissipation results in pain and unhappiness ultimately. The doctrine of thoughtless indulgence is unphilosophical and is contradicted by the experience of the race. Moreover, wisdom shows that the highest happiness comes not from the indulgence of the physical feelings alone, or to excess, but rather from the cultivation, development, and manifestation of the higher feelings, the social, aesthetic, and intellectual emotions. The higher pleasures of life, literature, art, music, science, invention, constructive imagination, etc., yield a satisfaction and happiness keener and more enduring than can possibly the lower forms of feeling. But the human being must not despise any part of his emotional being. Everything has its uses, which are good, and its abuses, which are bad. Every part of one's being, mental and physical, is well to use, but no part is well used if it uses the individual instead of being itself used. A recent writer has held that the end and aim of life should not be the pursuit of happiness, but rather the building of character. The obvious answer is that the two are identical in spirit, for to the man who appreciates the value of character, its attainment is the greatest happiness. The wise teach that the greatest happiness comes to him who is possessed of a well-rounded, developed character. Another writer has said that the aim of life should be self-improvement, with a due regard to the interest of others. This is but saying that the greatest happiness to the wise man lies in this course. Anyone who is wise enough, or great enough, to make these ends the aim and goal of his life will find the greatest happiness therefrom. Arnold Bennett advances as a good working philosophy of life cheerfulness, kindliness, and rectitude. Can anyone doubt that this course would bring great ultimate happiness? Happiness consists in that which contents the spirit, and the latter depends entirely upon the character of the feelings and emotions entertained by one, as weighed in the balance of reason, and as passed upon by judgment and the sense of right action. The greatest degree of happiness, or at least the greatest ratio of pleasure over pain, is obtained by a careful and intelligent cultivation of the feeling side of one's being in connection with the cultivation of the intellect and the mastery of the will. To be able to bring the capacity for enjoyment to its highest, to be able to intelligently choose that which will bring the greatest ultimate happiness in accordance with right action, and finally to be able to use the will in the direction of holding fast to that which is good and rejecting that which is bad. This is the power of creating happiness. The feelings, the intellect, and the will here, as ever, combine to manifest the result. Finally, it must be remembered that all human happiness consists in part of the ability to bear pain, to suffer. There must be the dash of stoicism in the wise Epicurean. One must learn to pluck from pain, suffering, and unhappiness the secret drop of honey which lies at its heart, and which consists in the knowledge of the meaning and use of pain, and the means whereby it may be transmuted into knowledge and experience, from which later happiness may be distilled. To profit by pain, to transmute suffering into joy, to transform present unhappiness into a future greater happiness, this is the privilege of the philosopher. The mental states and activities known as desire are a direct development of the feeling and emotional phase of the mind, and form the motive power of the will. Desire, in fact, may be said to be composed of feeling on one side and will on the other. But the influence of the intellect or reasoning faculties has a most important part to play in the evolution of feeling into desire, and in the consequent action of the will by the presentation and weighing of conflicting desires. Therefore, the logical place for the consideration of the activities of the intellect is at this point, between emotion and will. Accordingly, we shall leave the subject of feeling and emotion for the present, to be taken up again in connection with the subject of desire, after we have considered the intellectual processes of the mind. But, as has been indicated, we shall see the presence and influence of the feelings and emotions even in the activities of the intellect. End of chapter 19. End of section 8. Chapter 20. The Intellect. The class of mental states or processes grouped together under the name of intellectual processes form the second great division of the mental states, the two others being feeling and will respectively. Intellect has been defined as follows: the part or faculty of the human mind by which it knows, as distinguished from the power to feel and to will; the thinking faculty, the understanding; also as that faculty of the human mind by which it receives or comprehends the ideas communicated to it by the senses or the perception or other means, as distinguished from the power to feel and to will; the power or faculty to perceive objects in their relations; the power to judge and comprehend; also the capacity for higher forms of knowledge, as distinguished from the power to perceive and imagine. In the preceding chapters we have seen that the individual is able to experience sensations in consciousness, and that he is able to perceive them mentally, the latter being the first step in intellectual activity. We have also seen that he is able to reproduce the perception by means of memory and imagination, and that by means of the latter he is able to recombine and rearrange the objects of perception. We have also seen that he has what are known as feelings, which depend upon his previous experience and that of his progenitors. So far, the mind has been considered merely as a receiving and reproducing instrument, with the added attachment of the recombining power of the imagination. Up to this point, the mind may be compared to the phonographic cylinder, with an attachment capable of recombining its recorded impressions. The impressions are received and perceived, are stored away, are reproduced, and by the use of the imagination are recombined. Up to this point, the mind is seen to be more or less of an automatic instinctive faculty. It may be traced from the purely reflex activity of the lowest forms of life up through the lower animals, step by step, until a very high degree of mental power is perceived in animals like the horse, dog, or elephant. But there is something lacking. There is missing that peculiar power of thinking in symbols and abstract conceptions which distinguishes the human race, and which is closely bound up with the faculty of language or expressing thoughts in words. The comparatively high mental process of the lower animals is dwarfed by the human faculty of thinking, and thinking is a manifestation of the intellect. What is it to think? Strange to say, very few persons can answer this question correctly at first. They find themselves inclined to answer the inquiry in the words of the child. Why, to think is to think. Let us see if we can make it plain. The dictionary definition is a little too technical to be of much use to the beginner, but here it is. To employ any of the intellectual powers except that of simple perception through the senses. But what are the intellectual powers so employed, and how are they employed? Let us see. Stating the matter plainly in common terms, we may say that thinking is the mental process of 1. Comparing our perceptions of things with each other, noting the points of likeness and of difference. 2. Classifying them according to the ascertained likeness or difference, and thus tying them up in mental bundles, with each set of things of a kind in its own bundle. 3. Forming the abstract symbolic mental idea, concept, of each class of things so grouped, that we may afterward use as we use figures in mathematical calculations. 4. Using these concepts in order to form inferences, that is, to reason from the known to the unknown, and to form judgments regarding things. 5. Comparing these judgments, and deducing higher judgments from them, and so on. Without thinking, man will be dependent upon each particular experience for his knowledge, except so far as memory and imagination could instinctively aid him. By thought processes he is enabled to infer that if certain things be true of one of a certain kind of things, the same thing may be expected from others of the same class. As he is able to note points of likeness or difference, he is able to form clearer and truer inferences. In addition, he is able to apply his constructive imagination to the rearrangement and recombination of things whose nature he has discovered, and thus progress along the line of material achievement as well as of knowledge. It must be remembered, however, that the intellect depends entirely for its material upon the perception, which in turn receives its raw material from the senses. The intellect merely groups together the material of perception, makes inferences, draws conclusions from and forms conclusions regarding them, and in the case of constructive imagination, recombines them in effective forms and arrangement. The intellect is the last in order of the course of mental evolution. It appears last in order in the mind of the child, but it often persists in old age after the feelings have grown dim and the memory weak. Concepts. What is known as the concept is the first fruit of the elemental processes of thought. The various images of outside objects are sensed, then perceived, and then grouped according to their likenesses and differences, and the result is the production of concepts. It is difficult to define a concept so as to convey any meaning to the beginner. For instance, the dictionaries give the definition as an abstract general conception, idea, or notion formed in the mind. Not very clear this, is it? Perhaps we can understand it better if we say that the terms dog, cat, man, horse, house, etc. each expresses a concept. Every term expresses a concept. Every general name of a thing or quality is a term applied to the concept. We shall see this a little clearer as we proceed. We form a concept in this way. 1. We perceive a number of things. 2. Then we notice certain qualities possessed by things, certain properties, attributes, or characteristics which make the thing what it is. 3. Then we compare these qualities of the thing with the qualities of other things and see that there is a likeness in some cases, in various degrees, and a difference in other cases in various degrees. 4. Then we generalize or classify the perceived things according to their ascertained likenesses and differences. 5. Then we form a general idea or concept embodying each class of thing, and finally we give to the concept a term, or name, which is its symbol. The concept is a general idea of a class of things. The term is the expression of that general idea. The concept is the idea of a class of things. The term is the label affixed to the thing. To illustrate this last distinction, let us take the concept and term of bird, for instance. By perception, comparison, and classification of the qualities of living things, we have arrived at the conclusion that there exists a great general class, the qualities of which may be stated thus: warm-blooded, feathered, winged, oviparous, vertebrate. To this general class of quality-possessing animals we apply the English term bird. The name is merely a symbol. In German the term is Vogel, in Latin avis, but in each and every case the general idea or concept above stated, that is, warm-blooded, feathered, winged, oviparous, vertebrate, is meant. If anything is found having all those particular qualities, then we know it must be what we call a bird, and everything we call a bird must have those qualities. The term bird is the symbol for that particular combination of qualities existing in a thing. There is a difference between a mental image of the imagination and a concept. The mental image must always be of a particular thing, while a concept is always an idea of a general class of things which cannot be clearly pictured in the mind. For instance, the imagination may form the mental picture of any known bird, or even of an imaginary bird, but that bird always will be a distinct, particular bird. Try to form a mental image of a general class of birds. How would you do it? Do you realize the difficulty? First, such an image would have to include the characteristics of the large birds, such as the eagle, ostrich, and condor, and of the small birds, such as the wren and humming-bird. It must be a composite of the shape of all birds, from the ostrich, swan, eagle, crane, down to the sparrow, swallow, and humming-bird. It must picture the particular qualities of birds of prey, water birds, and domestic fowls, as well as the grain-eaters. It must exhibit all the colours found in bird life, from the brightest reds and greens down to the sober greys and browns. A little thought will show that a clear mental image of such a concept is impossible. What the most of us do when we think of bird is to picture a vague flying shape of dull colour. But when we stop to think that the term must also include the waddling duck and the scratching barnyard chicken, we see that our mental image is faulty. The trouble is that the term bird really means all bird, and we cannot picture an all bird from the very nature of the case. Our terms, therefore, are like mathematical figures or algebraic symbols, which we use for ease, speed, and clearness of thinking. The trouble does not end here. Concepts not only include the general idea of things, but also the general idea of the qualities of things. Thus, sweetness, hardness, courage, and energy are concepts, but we cannot form a mental image of them by themselves. We may picture a sweet thing, but not sweetness itself. So you see that a concept is a purely abstract mental idea, a symbol, akin to the figures 1, 2, 3, etc., and used in the same way. They stand for general classes of things. A term is the verbal and written expression of the general idea or concept. The student is requested to fix these distinctions in his mind, so as to render future understanding of them easy. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. Conception. The idea of conception has been well defined by Gordy as that act of mind by which it forms an idea of a class, or that act of the mind which enables us to use general names intelligently. He adds, "It is, of course, understood that I am using the word class to denote an indefinite number of individuals that resemble each other in certain particulars. Perception. The first step in conception, as we have seen, is that of perception. It is readily perceived that the character of our intellectual processes depends materially upon the variety, clearness, and accuracy of our perceptions. Therefore, again, we would refer our students to the chapter in which we have stated the importance of clear perception. Memory. The future steps of conception depend materially upon the clearness of the memory, as we can classify objects only by remembering their qualities beyond the immediate moment of actual original perception. Therefore, the memory should be strengthened for this as well as other objects. Abstraction. The second step in conception is that of the mental abstraction of qualities from the observed thing. That is, we must perceive and then mentally set aside the observed qualities of the thing. For instance, man first perceived the existence of certain qualities in things. He found that a certain number of things possessed some of these qualities in common, while others possessed other qualities in the same way, and thus arose classification from comparison. But both comparison and classification are possible only by abstraction, or the perception of the quality as a thing. Thus the abstraction of the idea of the quality of sweetness from the idea of sugar. Sweetness is a quality rather than a thing itself. It is something possessed by sugar which helps to make sugar what it is. Color, shape, size, mental qualities, habits of action. These are some of the qualities first observed in things and abstracted from them in thought. Redness, sweetness, hardness, softness, largeness, smallness, fragrance, swiftness, slowness, fierceness, gentleness, warmness, coldness, etc. These are abstracted qualities of things. Of course, these qualities are never really divorced from things, but the mind divorces them in order to make thinking easier. An authority says, "Animals are incapable of making abstractions, and that is the reason why they cannot develop formal thought." Abstract thought is identical with rational thought, which is the characteristic feature of the thought of speaking beings. This is the reason why abstract thought is upon earth the exclusive property of man, and why brutes are incapable of abstract thought. The process of naming is the mechanism of abstraction, for names establish the mental independence of the objects named. The processes of abstraction depend upon attention, concentrated attention. Attention directed to the qualities of a thing tends to abstract the qualities in thought from the thing itself. Mill says, "Abstraction is primarily the result of attention." Hamilton says, "Attention and abstraction are only the same process viewed in different relations." Cultivation of the power of abstraction means principally cultivation of attention. Any mental activity which tends towards analysis or separation of a thing into its parts, qualities, or elements will serve to cultivate and develop the power of abstraction. The habit of converting qualities into concepts is acquired by transforming adjective terms into their corresponding noun terms. For instance, a piece of colored candy possesses the qualities of being round, hard, red, sweet, etc. Transforming these adjective qualities into noun terms, we have the concepts of roundness, hardness, redness, and sweetness, respectively. Comparison. The third step in conception is that of comparison, in which the qualities of several things are compared or examined for likenesses and differences. We find many qualities in which several things differ, and a few in which there is a likeness. Classes are formed from resemblances or likenesses, while individuals are separated from apparent classes by detection of differences. Finally, it is found that separate things, while having many points of difference which indicate their individuality, nevertheless have a few points of likeness which indicate that they belong to the same general family or class. The detection of likenesses and differences in the qualities of various things is an important mental process. Many of the higher thought processes depend largely upon the ability to compare things properly. The development of attention and perception tends to develop the power of comparison. Classification or generalization. The fourth step in conception is that of classification or generalization, whereby we place individual things in a mental bundle or class, and then this bundle in company with other bundles into a higher class, and so on. Thus we group all the individual small birds having certain characteristics into a species, then several related species into a larger family, and this into a still larger, until we finally group all the bird families into the great concept which we call birds, and of which the simple term bird expresses the general concept. Jevons says, "We classify things together whenever we observe that they are like each other in any respect, and therefore think of them together. In classifying a collection of objects, we do not merely put together into groups those which resemble each other, but we also divide each class into smaller ones, in which the resemblance is more complete. Thus the class of white substances may be divided into those which are solid and those which are fluid, so that we get the two minor classes of solid white and fluid white. It is desirable to have names by which to show that one class is contained in another, and accordingly we call the class which is divided into two or more smaller species the genus, and the smaller ones into which it is divided the species. Every species is a small family of the individuals composing it, and at the same time is an individual species of the genus just above it. The genus, in turn, is a family of several species, and at the same time an individual genus in the greater family or genus above it." The student may familiarize himself with the idea of generalization by considering himself as an individual, John Smith. John represents that unit of generalization. The next step is to combine John with the other Smiths of his immediate family. Then this family may be grouped with his near blood relations, and so on, until finally all the related Smiths, near and remote, are grouped together in a great Smith family. Or, in the same way, the family group may be enlarged until it takes in all the white people in a county, then all the white people in the state, then all in the United States, then all the white races, then all the white and other light-skinned races, then all mankind. Then, if one is inclined, the process may be continued until it embraces every living creature from Moneron to man. Reversing the process, living creatures may be divided and subdivided until all mankind is seen to stand as a class. Then the race of man may be divided into sub-races according to colour. Then the white race may be subdivided into Americans and non-Americans. Then the Americans may be divided into the inhabitants of the several states, or into Indianans or non-Indianans, then into the inhabitants of the several counties of Indiana, and thus the Posey Countians are reached. Then the Posey County people are divided into Smiths and non-Smiths, then the Smith family into its constituent family groups, and then into the smaller families, and so on, until the classification reaches one particular John Smith, who at last is found to be an individual, in a class by himself. This is the story of the ascending and descending processes of generalization. End of chapter 21. End of section 9.